Good evening, everybody. Good to see so many of you here today. Probably a nice relief to come in a nice air-conditioned area to enjoy this evening's presentation. I'm Carol Reardon. I'm part of the Gettysburg Foundation, and the Foundation and our partners, the National Park Service, are delighted to present to you the series of Sacred Trust events that we're in the middle of them now. We've had the first two and the last two evenings, the third one tonight. And then, okay, go and celebrate the 4th of July tomorrow, but come on back on the 5th and the 6th, and we will round out the Sacred Trust series for 2025. Now, I've been given the responsibility of introducing our speaker tonight. Now, many of you know that I like to tell stories, and that if you put a microphone in front of me, you never quite know what'll happen. Now, I have to explain that I have known our speaker since she was in graduate school. We go back a long time. Therefore, for her safety and for mine, I've been scripted for tonight, and I have to stick with this, so I am going to read this because that's what I was told to do. Okay, our speaker tonight is Lesley J. Gordon, and her talk is entitled Dread Danger, Cowardice and Combat in the American Civil War, a topic that is very much appropriate for July 3rd at Gettysburg. When confronted with the abject fear of going into battle, Civil War soldiers were expected to overcome the dread of the oncoming danger with feats of courage and victory on the battlefield. The Fire Zouaves and the 2nd Texas Infantry went to war with high expectations that they would perform bravely. Both had experienced commanders and enthusiastic community support. How could they possibly fail? Yet falter they did, facing humiliating charges of cowardice that cast a lingering shadow on them, despite their best efforts at redemption. By the end of the war, however, these charges were largely forgotten, replaced with the jingoistic rhetoric of martial heroism. That is proof positive I did not write this. A legacy that led many, including historians, to insist that all Civil War soldiers were heroes. Lesley J. Gordon will discuss her new book, Dread Danger, and the ways in which the experiences of these two regiments help us gain a greater understanding of the Civil War soldier experience. She will also share the story of the 126th New York Volunteer Infantry, labeled the Harper's Ferry Cowards, who found redemption at Gettysburg. Their experience contrasts in important ways with that of the Texans and New Yorkers. Lesley J. Gordon is a historian and author specializing in the American Civil War. Since 2016, she has held the Charles G. Summersell Chair of Southern History at the University of Alabama. Her scholarship seeks to challenge traditional narratives and offers fresh perspectives. Gordon's latest book, Dread Danger, available for purchase after this talk is over. Dread Danger, Cowardice and Combat in the American Civil War, explores allegations of cowardice and their lasting impact on individuals and units. Her previous works, including A Broken Regiment, the 16th Connecticut's Civil War, and George E. Pickett in Life and Legend, we do have some common bonds. We both have this thing about Pickett, have been widely praised by scholars and general readers. Recently, Professor Gordon served as the visiting Charles Bull Ewing Chair in Military History at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Please welcome Lesley Gordon.
Thank you, Carol. So can you all hear me? Is this mic? Yes, no? Because I've got this mic and I've got this mic.
This one will go off as long as you have this one
Okay.
switched on.
Okay. All right. Well, if you all can't hear me in the back, just like wave your arms or something, okay? It's really a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I want to thank Wayne Motz. I want to thank, Wayne's here somewhere, right? I want to thank Carol. I want to thank Britt. And everybody with the Gettysburg Foundation for helping to put this together tonight. Gettysburg is a very special place for me. This book is not about Gettysburg, but I will talk about Gettysburg at the end. Okay, so we'll make a connection. Before I get into explaining and giving you a summary of these two regiments, I want to say a little bit about why I wrote the book, the kind of backstory. My first two books, both my book on George Pickett and my book on the 16th Connecticut, try to explore the creation of mythologies and ask questions about why we remember some things and forget others. And so this book in many ways was a continuation of those themes. But the topic of cowardice kept coming up. And if you know anything about George Pickett, he actually was accused of being a coward here on July 3rd as his charge was happening in front of him. Frankly, I don't think he was hiding behind a tree, but some people accused him of just that. But he was, in other cases, accused of being a coward. The 16th Connecticut faced allegations of cowardice at the Battle of Antietam. So I wanted to focus just on the topic and kind of, frankly, get it out of my system. Because like I said, it just kept reappearing. And one of the things that struck me was the fact that very few historians did want to write about it. It was either dismissed, explained away, sort of the argument was that it wasn't that important, that any individual or unit that was accused of being a coward made up for it, redeemed themselves in some manner. And that, I do agree, is often the case. But I still was convinced that the topic was interesting enough to write a whole book. And I also thought that there were effects from these kind of shameful charges, that you didn't just easily recover from being called a coward, which, by the way, and if you'll see in my book, I'm not even that concerned whether or not in the case of these two regiments, the allegations were accurate. And I would argue in both cases, they're really not fair at all. I'm much more interested in why it happened and then the reaction to it. These are some quotes from some very well-known Civil War historians addressing the topic. And I want to make clear, it's not that nobody's ever talked about it. People have, certainly. But again, I believe that there was still a gap for me to fill in this book. The famous Bell Wiley, right, the dean of the common soldier, he observed in his book in 1943 on Johnny Reb that essentially it just wasn't very interesting. It didn't seem to draw a lot of attention writing about cowardice in combat. And then James McPherson, right, another celebrated Civil War historian, he admitted in his book For Cause and Comrades that Civil War soldiers themselves certainly talked about it, even more so than heroism, but he doesn't talk about it. He's not that interested in it either. So like I said, that's what led me to write this book. The title comes from a chaplain, William Lovelace Foster, who was in the 35th Mississippi. He served alongside the 2nd Texas, one of the units I'm going to focus on tonight. He was describing to his wife what it was like to be at the siege of Vicksburg, and he was trying to explain the atmosphere and anxiety that the men he served with were undergoing. And he uses this phrase in the second paragraph, dread danger, the worry, the fear, the anxiety that was almost unbearable for soldiers until they actually went into battle. So that's where the title comes from. So I chose 2 regiments. I had others, including, frankly, the 126th New York. I realized I was never going to finish this book if I did more than 2, so I ended up settling on them. And I like to think there's a nice balance, one northern, one southern, one from the Eastern Theater, one from the Western Theater, but certainly there's many others that would fit the category of facing the kind of allegations that these 2 faced. Also, of course, it was important to have regiments where there was a lot of material. There were first-hand accounts, newspaper reports, post-war memoirs, and I use all of it. All of it I found meaningful and relevant. So I want to start with the Fire Zouaves, very famous. Elmer Ellsworth was their commander. And before I tell you about the Fire Zouaves, I do have to talk about him a little bit. Elmer Ellsworth was probably one of the most famous people in the entire country on the eve of the Civil War. He had founded a company of Zouaves from Chicago. He trained them, he drilled them. He gained great celebrity from touring the country with them, and they showed off their skills, their drills. It was very gymnastical, that's a word. And he was in the newspaper. He was very dapper, loved being in the camera, loved, having the camera on him. Photography was taking off. The newspaper coverage of him was mostly positive. Some of it was negative. But he also became friends and kind of a protege of Abraham Lincoln. He worked in Lincoln's law office in Springfield. So he had these two reasons why he was becoming famous. And he traveled with Lincoln to Washington, D.C. when Lincoln became president. Excuse me. And he was trying to convince Lincoln to create an office of the militia. Ellsworth was never formally in the Army. He raised militia units and trained them, like the Zouaves from Chicago. He wanted to go to West Point, never did. But that, of course, doesn't happen, the militia dream of his. Instead, the war begins. He rushes to New York City, and he decides he wants volunteer firemen to serve in his brand new regiment. Why did he choose firemen? Well, because, he argues, they could be instant soldiers. They could be ready for instant service. No one doubts the bravery of firemen today. No one doubted the bravery of firemen in the 19th century. These were men who literally ran into burning buildings to save people. He believed, and it turns out to be erroneous, that he could raise this regiment and immediately lead them into battle. And it's not going to go quite as directly and simply as he had hoped. It turns out that making firemen into soldiers is not entirely easy. These firemen, and remember too, he's again trying to raise them as Zouaves with a very distinctive dress and drill style and sort of bravado. They didn't like conformity. They balked at any kind of order or discipline. They were troublemakers, not all of them, but many of them, and some of them criminals. They were robbing, stealing, setting fires to put them out. There were even serious allegations of rape. They were really a handful for him, and he doesn't know what to do. He's claiming that everything's fine. He's writing letters to his fiancée, claiming that they're the best ready regiment in the entire country. That could not be further from the truth. For a while, they were housed in the Capitol building because Washington, D.C. was being overwhelmed by soldiers. This is, again, this early spring of 61, just after the war begins. And here's an image from one of the newspapers at the time, right? Harper's showing the Zouaves, and you can see them kind of sitting about and pretending that they're lawmakers. So they're having quite a good time, not being very serious, frankly, about learning how to be a soldier. And then catastrophe hits. Ellsworth himself is killed. This is a whole nother story, and a whole nother fascinating story, to say the least, but to distill it down for our purposes tonight, Ellsworth, who, remember, he is friends with Lincoln, he uses his political connections to insist that his regiment of Zouaves be the first to land at Alexandria, Virginia, when the Union moves into that town in late May of 1861. He ignores orders, he refuses to cooperate with other officers and units, and just makes his way into the town early in the morning of May 24th. And he leaves his men, they're still getting off the boats, and he rushes forward to what he sees to be a huge rebel flag waving over a boarding house. Ellsworth, this is an image showing the sort of plot line of his death. He rushes into the boarding house. He personally takes down the flag while he's descending the steps. The owner of the boarding house confronts him with a shotgun and shoots him right through the chest, and he's dead. Well, his Fire Zouaves are going to implode. They have lost Ellsworth, who, even though they bucked against, they adored him. And they're going to lose more and more advocates to protect them and to look out for them. Their new colonel is a man named Noah Farnham, who's a fireman like them, but he quickly realizes that he's got to get them ready for actual battle. He takes away most of the Zouave trappings. He stops drilling them the way Ellsworth did. He's trying to make them soldiers, and they are miserable. And that's going to lead us to the Battle of Bull Run. So they will fight on July 21st, 1861, late in the day or the afternoon of the battle. They're ordered in to action on Henry Hill. They're supposed to support an artillery position. And if you know, I'm sure everybody in this room probably knows what's going to happen at Bull Run. It is a debacle for the Union. And by the end of the day, the Confederates have the Union forces on the run. Well, the Zouaves, who are there with their commander that they don't like, they're still grieving, Ellsworth, they get in the midst of this and they panic, like almost every other Union unit that day. But they will be blamed for Bull Run. Amongst all the regiments, they will be singled out. There will be a congressional investigation, and one of the officers testifying against them uses this comment, which I thought was just so telling. He says the Zouaves had effervescent courage, that it completely disappeared as soon as they were actually in combat. Some of them, mind you, did regroup and keep fighting and fight well. But what's going to come out, the dominant story about the Zouaves and what's covered in the newspapers is their bad behavior before the battle and this idea that they let the Union down, they broke, they ran away, and then everybody else followed suit. And this is going to be devastating to them. Devastating. They will never recover. The 11th New York will only last until June of 1862. Almost 1 year later, they will no longer exist. At one point, survivors of the unit gather in New York City and they list grievances of how they feel they've been victimized by these allegations. And it's quite detailed. They have a lot to say. These are just a few examples of a quote from the New York Times. They'd been fed like dogs, deprived of the credit of what they did in the field of battle. They felt they performed as best they could under the conditions. It's their first battle. There was, of course, a lot of chaos for everybody. They were very resentful toward their officers, very resentful toward Noah Farnham, who, by the way, will die. He was mortally wounded at Bull Run. But this will be the end of the Fire Zouaves. So let me shift to the second Texas. So we're going to move much further south, deep south, Texas, Houston, Galveston, the fall of 61. What I found really fascinating when I was writing the book, I spent a lot of time looking at newspapers, and of course we can do so much with digitized newspapers today. I was surprised to discover that the rise and fall of the Zouaves that I just explained to you was covered intently by the Texas newspapers. And they took great satisfaction from the complete collapse of Ellsworth and his Fire Zouaves. So this unit comes into being, mustered in the fall, like I said, and they in many ways represent the most famous names, storied history of Texas, from when it was a republic through the time it became part of the United States. Sam Houston's own son was a member. It had West Point graduates. It had Mexican-American War veterans, Texas Revolution veterans. So like the Zouaves on the surface, they seem to be completely ready and prepared to perform valorous in combat. There was no question on the surface that these men would be brave. This is a quote from Ralph Smith. I use him a lot in the book. He's a private, and he wrote about, in very, I think, blunt terms, what it was like to be a soldier. And he talks about the feeling just before they leave for the front in the late fall, winter, into the spring of 62, how they felt that they, as he said here, we were wine and flattered. Night after night, we floated upon a sea of glory. What could go wrong? These men are also, of course, hearing these expectations around them from family, from newspapers, from their officers, telling them how brave they are, telling them how cowardly the Union soldiers were. And this was a poem that I found by a teenager, Molly Moore. She wrote this. It's quite bloody, frankly, quite bleak. But she talks in this poem about essentially, right, the idea that cowards would shrink and cower, literally, but Texans, brave Texans like the Second Texas, would go to death or victory. So like I said, these are the high expectations. And it's pressure. And Smith and others, it's not that they don't recognize the pressure of these expectations, But like I said, the notion was that they would all be heroes. Well, things are going to go very wrong for this unit at Shiloh in April of 1862. And just to give you a short overview of their experience, they fight well on the first day of Shiloh, April 6th. The first day of Shiloh goes fairly well for the Confederates, although they lose their commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, of course, who dies on April 6th. But as we know, right, the first day is a Confederate win, though the Confederates are not able to capitalize on it. Grant, who is there, arrives on the ground on the day of April 6th, and there's reinforcements, and the momentum completely shifts by the second day of battle, April 7th. So the 2nd Texas will be fighting along the right flank of the Confederate line at Shiloh. And this is the situation, as best as I've been able to sort it out from all the descriptions. They were holding a position, and they were being told by William Hardee, a general on the ground there, urging the men of the 2nd Texas and other soldiers to wait and not fire, that there were men coming toward them. They could see them through the forest, but not to fire. These were reinforcements. They were not reinforcements. They were Confederate. They were Union soldiers. And so once those Union soldiers, it becomes clear it's the enemy, the 2nd Texas and other units break and run. The shock was so grave. Some of them regroup, like the 11th New York. But what is going to be talked about, especially by Hardee, but mentioned in newspapers and private letters, were the allegations of cowardice. Hardee himself called them a pack of cowards. Well, this is William Rogers. William Rogers was their 2nd colonel. Their 1st colonel was John Moore, who's a West Pointer. William Rogers becomes their colonel later because Moore will be promoted and moved to brigade command. And Rogers is writing his wife in shock that there's any whisper that he and his men were cowards. And you see him defending them. And this is a photo, by the way, of the original flag held by the 2nd Texas at Shiloh and at Corinth. I'm going to tell you about Corinth in a minute. And you can see Shiloh stitched at the top. That was a battle honor for a regiment to have that included. And so he's saying to his wife, we were allowed to put Shiloh on our flag. We've been praised by everybody. What is this nonsense of rumors and allegations of cowardice? 6 months are going to go by, and Rogers is not going to let this go. He keeps writing his wife. He tries to have articles planted in the Houston Tri-Weekly Telegraph defending the unit. Moore, by the way, is also under attack. His promotion is being held up in Richmond because of these rumors. And we get to October of 1862 at the Battle of Corinth, where Confederates were trying to retake the city. The 2nd Texas is there, of course, with many other units, but Rogers himself is singled out to lead really a suicide mission and take Fort Robinette, a very well-protected position in the Union line. I found evidence that he questioned the order when he was told to do it. But at the same time, there's no question in my mind that he knew the best way to prove not just his own honor and bravery, but that of his men, was to lead a charge like this and potentially even die. That would wash away any question of his heroism. Well, he will lead that charge, and he will die. This is a photograph that actually shows his body in the foreground with the beard. His body's been stripped largely of clothes. He's barefoot. This is a very unusual photograph for many reasons. One of the reasons is the fact that we know who is in this photo. We know this is Rogers. Secondly, we don't have that many photographs from the Western Theater. We have many, of course, here of Gettysburg. There's a quote from this private in the 8th Wisconsin Infantry who was walking around the battlefield after the battle. By the way, it was a Union victory. The Confederates lost. And George Driggs was writing home to his newspaper in Wisconsin, and he he saw the photographer taking this very picture, and he said he felt sick to his stomach. This photo will become widely circulated when it becomes a lithograph and it's reproduced in newspapers all over the country. And one of the reasons I also think it's so powerful is because, to me, this is not the image of heroic warfare. To me, this emphasizes the waste and the horror of war. And here is Rogers. Other details about him. He was wearing an iron vest. He was discovered wearing an iron vest when he made that charge. He clearly didn't want to die, or wasn't so sure about it. Also, we know he raised a white flag, a white handkerchief. So he realized at one point, this is not going to work. He already has suspicions. Finally, there was a letter in his coat pocket discovered by a Union soldier, writing him a letter, from a wife of a soldier in his unit, writing to Rogers, asking him to help defend her husband, who had been singled out at Shiloh for cowardice, in addition to all these other rumors circling about. So to me, we know he was also apparently yelling, "Remember Shiloh." We know, I think, right, pretty confidently, I would say, that he had Shiloh on his mind, that he had allegations of cowardice on his mind until his final moments. Most all of what I just told you will be forgotten in the historical record. Even that photo, even though it was so well circulated, the story's going to start to fade, not without Hardie trying, though. Hardie is not going to let this go just yet. He writes his official report of Shiloh in February of 1863. It took him a while, apparently. He also, in another letter in October, he wrote to Richmond, to the War Department, describing in detail what he claimed he saw happen to the 2nd Texas. And he recounts telling one of his staff, right, you can see here, that he was going to call them a pack of cowards. He was beside himself with what he claimed he witnessed amongst these men that day. But despite Hardie's attempts, despite that image, despite those rumors, most of what I told you about the 2nd Texas at Shiloh, we largely overshadowed. The 2nd Texas fights to the very end. They're in service to the very end until June, actually, of 1865. They will be at Vicksburg. They will man the famed 2nd Texas Lunette on the outskirts of the city, defending the city against Grant before the siege begins. That quote, as I showed you from Foster, they will, of course, be alongside those Mississippi units or Mississippi troops. But the after effect, I argue, of Shiloh, will stay with them and still cast a shadow. This is Ralph Smith talking about experience of the survivors of the 2nd Texas at Galveston. By this time of the war, they're a skeleton regiment. There's very few of them left. And he's reconfiguring the whole definition of heroism, that no longer were they fighting Yankees and the hated enemy. They were fighting disease. They were fighting starvation. And heroism came from just withstanding that and watching comrades die. But like I said, I think largely the heroism narrative is what's going to be remembered. These two images show you what I'm talking about, even from the war itself. So I talk about in the book how there's a tension and almost like a, tug of war between the story, I would argue the actual story, the more complicated and ambiguous story of both these units and their struggles with these allegations, and then the more heroic, simplistic story that will endure, and the one that will be retold and told even by historians today. To your left, that is an image of Corinth, and you can see at the top of the ramparts there, the man with the flag, that is Rogers. He was waving the flag before he was killed. A much different image from his body lying there in that pile. And to your right, this is the Fire Zouaves fighting with their hands against cavalry. No, not very accurate. They did get into it with cavalry, but not quite in this fashion, not as dramatic. So let me tell you briefly about one other unit before I wrap up. The 126th New York, like the 11th New York, like the 2nd Texas, they will also be called cowards. And again, for all three of these regiments, these allegations mattered. They weren't easily explained away. They weren't easily forgotten, at least for the men themselves. The 126th New York comes later in 1862, so they'll come in the second wave of enlistments in the second year of the war. They will find themselves at Harper's Ferry. And unfortunately, they will all be captured. They fight, of course, before the capture. They're captured on September 15th. They surrender. They will end up at Camp Douglas, Illinois. There will be a military commission called to investigate what went wrong at Harper's Ferry. And like, interestingly, the 11th New York, they will be singled out. Now, this moniker, Harper's Ferry's Cowards, actually was applied to 3 other New York units: the 125th, the 111th, and the 39th. They were all together at Harper's Ferry. They were all at Camp Douglas waiting exchange, very demoralized, wondering why they ever enlisted. And they're called Harper's Ferry Cowards, in a really sort of bullying way by these Illinois units. These aren't Confederates, of course. These are Illinois guards that they're interacting with. And like I said, the label, it's gonna stick. It's for all 4 units, but the 126th gets the worst of it, especially in that investigation, in the press. They're very self-conscious of it. Well, that brings us here to Gettysburg on July 2nd. By the time of Gettysburg, in the summer of '63, the 126th New York, along with the rest of Harper's Ferry's cowards, have been reorganized, retrained, I would say. They came under the leadership of Alexander Hayes, who took upon himself to redeem these men, to make them real soldiers. And Hayes, himself, physically is very formidable man, West Pointer, very blunt. They loved him, and he set them on the path to redemption here at Gettysburg. They will be fighting late in the day on July 2nd. In the evening, near Plum Run, there will be a charge, very dramatic, very successful. Several members will earn Congressional Medals of Honor. And they will be yelling, "Remember Harper's Ferry," just like "Remember Shiloh." And Hayes, who I think, clearly had a mind for the dramatic, after the battle, they're also facing Pickett's charge, by the way, on July 3rd. And they fight somewhat, but not quite as dramatically, as July 2nd. But Hayes gets some of the captured flags from the Confederates after the fight, after the Confederate defeat, and he picks out ones, I'm sure his staff did this, picks out flags that had Harper's Ferry on it. So these would have been Confederates at Harper's Ferry that captured the Harper's Ferry cowards. And he gets on his horse and he drags them with his staff in the dirt. And so the 126th, along with those other New Yorkers, are cheering, right? This is it. They've made it. They did it. They are rid of this horrific shame. The 126th goes on. They fight well, all the way to Appomattox Courthouse. Very storied regiment. They have reunions right here at Gettysburg, multiple reunions. They have a regimental history. But you know what they will not let go? Harper's Ferry. They will not let go of those allegations. They will not let, in a really interesting twist, they don't want to forget it. Because for them, right, they feel they have been mistreated. They feel this was never fair in the first place. And they want to be sure that nobody forgets that, in fact, they were actually heroes. There's a line in their regimental history that these allegations at Harper's Ferry made them victims rather than heroes. And so they want to flip the script and say that they were actually heroes. So I want to close with a quote from another campaign. We've been moving through a lot of campaigns today, But this is back in the Peninsula Campaign in 1862 in Virginia. I was looking at Joe Glatar's book on Lee's army. This is when I still was casting about to see if I would add any more regiments to my book. And he has this quote from a Georgian, Alfred Colquitt, who's writing a private letter back to Georgia. And he describes witnessing men in his own unit breaking and running away in battle. And he says something I think so prescient. He says, "This is a secret history of the fight you will not see published." And he's right. He's right. But guess what? Now you get to read them and see it published. So thank you very much.